Have you ever wondered why people choose a bus over a plane? A plane is just 2 hours in the sky. It's sterile, fast, and usually completely soulless. You enter a metal tube at one point in the world and exit at another, without ever truly feeling the distance covered. But the Przemysl to Paris route on the Highway E40 is something else entirely. It's 28 hours of forced intimacy with total strangers. It is thousands of kilometers of asphalt that you swallow together. It is impossible to pretend here. By the 10th hour of the journey, when the cabin begins to smell of exhaustion, strong tea, and stagnant air, the masks fall off every passenger. People become who they truly are. That evening at platform number 4 in Przemysl, it was particularly restless. A spring fog, thick and damp, mingled with the diesel exhaust of the idling engines. The boarding line resembled a living, multi-faced organism that pulsed constantly. I was checking documents, mechanically marking the manifest when he approached the door. The man looked to be about 70, perhaps older. He stood out among the crowd of migrant workers in their tracksuits and hoodies. He wore an old but perfectly clean jacket, and around his neck was a checkered scarf tied in a French knot, which he adjusted from time to time with thin, trembling fingers. In his hands, he held neither a suitcase nor a travel bag, nor even a backpack. He held an old, worn-out violin case. "Mr. Driver," he said quietly but clearly, "is there a special place in the luggage for my lady? She doesn't like the cold, and the road promises to be freezing." I looked into his eyes. They were clear, almost like a child's. But behind that clarity hid an indescribable weariness. I smiled and suggested he take the instrument right into the cabin. "Keep her with you, it's safer that way," I replied. His name was Mr. Stefan. As it turned out later, he was going to Paris not for family, not for a tour, and certainly not for work. He was going there to fulfill a debt that was more than 40 years old, a debt that weighed more than our entire bus. We left at exactly 9 in the evening. The bus pushed heavily away from the platform, its tires humming dully against the wet pavement of Przemysl, and we set a course for the west, merging onto the great artery of the E40. In the cabin, the blue nightlight was turned on. It has a magical quality. It makes people's faces look flat, like death masks, while simultaneously creating an illusion of total solitude in the middle of a crowd. Stepan's neighbor was Katya, a girl of about 25. All the way to Krakow, she nervously scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of the screen. She was going to Paris because she had to. It was a classic escape. An escape from a failed marriage, from empty pockets, and worst of all, from the emptiness inside herself. She looked like someone who no longer believed in anything and, frankly, expected nothing good from this world anymore. Somewhere near Wrocław, when most of the passengers had already fallen into a restless sleep, interrupted only by heavy sighs or snoring, Stefan began to tell his story. He didn't speak loudly. He seemed to be merely thinking aloud, but in the silence of the night bus, his voice had such a magnetic depth that even I, focused on the road, involuntarily listened. "You know, Katrusia," he said, gently stroking the violin case, "Paris is not a city of lights. For some, it's a city of loss. For others, a city of promises. In 1982, I was a young musician. My future seemed written in notes. I was supposed to perform at the Opera Garnier, but fate and the Iron Curtain decided otherwise. I stayed here, in a cage, and my violin, she was silent for 40 long years." Katya finally looked away from her phone. She took off her headphones, and her eyes came to life for the first time during the trip. A spark of genuine curiosity appeared in them. "Why was she silent?" she whispered. "Because I promised the woman I loved more than anything in the world that the next time this violin sounded, it would only be on the banks of the Seine, near the Pont Alexander III. She waited for me there 40 years ago. She didn't know that I simply wasn't allowed to leave. I was held back by offices, papers, and people who were afraid of a free sound." Stepan opened the case, and in the dim blue light, the instrument gleamed like a piece of old, seasoned amber. However, the violin was in terrible condition. The wood was cracked in several places, the varnish had peeled, and most importantly, there wasn't a single string on it. "But you can't play it," the girl noted, touching the cold wood with her finger. Stepan smiled sadly, a smile full of the kind of wisdom you don't find in books. You can't play the music that ears hear on it, child. But you can play memory on it, and sometimes that is much louder. Night on the German autobahns can be treacherous and cold. Around 3 in the morning, we stopped at a gas station near Erfurt. It was a routine technical stop. Passengers poured out to breathe the freezing air, drink disgusting vending machine coffee, and stretch their cramped legs. It was then that an event occurred that changed the entire mood of our trip. 3 local guys in dark hoodies, clearly looking for an easy target or just wanting to vent their nocturnal aggression, noticed Stefan. He was standing slightly apart from the group, holding his antique case. The teenagers decided the old man was carrying a real treasure, an antique that could be quickly resold. One of them, the tallest, blocked Stepan's path and began shouting something in German, demanding he open the bag. Stepan pressed the case to his chest so hard it was as if it were not wood, but a living infant. Katja, who was standing nearby smoking a thin cigarette, turned pale instantly. But to my surprise, she didn't take a single step back. When the boy tried to snatch the case from the old man's hands, Stepan fell to his knees right into a dirty puddle, begging them not to open it in the cold because the wood wouldn't survive. I had already jumped out of the cabin, clutching a heavy flashlight ready for a fight, but Katja beat everyone to it. She didn't scream. She simply walked up to the guy, confidently snatched the case back, and spoke to them in such a fierce and yet refined French that they froze in surprise. She explained that this wasn't money. It wasn't gold. It was her grandfather's heart. And if they so much as scratched the varnish, they would be killing a living man right there. The boys, confused by such pressure in a language they didn't understand, only grumbled and disappeared into the shadows of the gas station. Stepan stood up, brushed the dirt off his old jacket, and looked at Katja as if he had seen an angel. "Thank you," he murmured. "There really is a treasure in this violin, but not the one they dreamed of." About 6 hours remained until Paris. Dawn began to slowly blur the horizon over the German fields, turning the nocturnal gloom into a delicate, almost transparent pink haze. Katja no longer returned to her phone. She sat turned toward Stepan and listened. The musician, with trembling hands, took a small bundle of old paper from under the velvet lining of the case. These were letters. Dozens of yellowed envelopes tied with a thin ribbon, and a small black and white photograph of a girl with incredibly deep and sad eyes. Her name was Claire. She was a French woman who had come to Lviv to study back in the early 80s. They loved as people only love in their youth, desperately and forever. They were supposed to run away together, but the system proved stronger than their dreams. Claire wrote to him for 10 years straight, never losing hope. In the last letter, dated the early 90s, there was only one sentence. "I will be waiting for you at our place every April 28th, as long as I have even a drop of strength in my hands to hold flowers." Katja looked at the clock on her phone. Today was exactly April 28th. "Will we make it?" she asked, with a hope in her voice I hadn't heard from young people in many years. I looked at the navigator. Over 400 kilometers remained to Paris, and the clock was relentlessly counting down. We were supposed to arrive at 10 in the morning. We had only 1 hour of buffer for Stepan to make it to the bridge by noon. At that moment, the entire bus seemed to become part of this drama. People who had previously argued over reclined seats or loud videos were now handing Stepan hot coffee, sharing sandwiches, and encouraging him. We stopped being random fellow travelers on the E40. We turned into the crew of a ship carrying hope. Paris greeted us with heavy traffic jams on the Peripherique Ring Road. Stepan nervously squeezed the handle of the case, his gaze darting between the window and the clock on the dashboard. When we finally entered the center and reached the Pont Alexander III, the sun was already high. The golden statues on the bridge's columns shone so brightly it was blinding. I stopped my neoplan in an absolutely prohibited spot, blocking a lane of traffic. I didn't care about the fines. Stepan stepped out of the cabin, clutching his broken violin. His steps were heavy, his legs shaking from exhaustion, but he moved forward. The bridge was full of tourists, photographers, and artists. But there, at the very edge where a cast-iron lamp cast a long shadow on the pavement, stood an elderly woman. She was dressed in an elegant lavender coat, and a thin lace shawl lay on her shoulders. In her hands was a small, slightly wilted bouquet of dried rosehips. She wasn't looking at the Eiffel Tower. She didn't notice the beauty of the city. She was looking at the road where the large international buses stopped. Stefan stopped a few meters away from her. He slowly, with the solemnity of a priest, opened the case, took out the violin without a single string, tucked it under his chin, and began to play. He moved the bow across the silent wood. Physically, there was no sound. There was only the scratching of horsehair against varnish. But all of us, me, Katya, the passengers glued to the bus windows, we swear we heard music. It was a melody of such power, such longing, and at the same time, such triumphant loyalty, that passers-by began to stop, not understanding where the sound was coming from. The woman slowly turned around. The bouquet of dried flowers slipped from her hands and fell onto the pavement. "Etienne?" she whispered, and the sound was quieter than the wind over the Seine, but it pierced through everything. "I'm 40 years late, Claire, but I've arrived," he replied. They didn't rush into an embrace like in a movie. They just stood side by side and held hands, looking into each other's eyes. In those eyes, an entire lifetime flashed in an instant. The pain of separation, the years of waiting, and this incredible victory over time. I've seen thousands of stories on the Highway E40. I've seen broken destinies. I've seen meanness and nobility. But that day changed my own soul. Stefan left his violin right there, on the parapet of the bridge. He said it had finally fulfilled its main mission. It had carried his heart to where it was supposed to be since the last century. And what about Katya? She didn't go looking for some job just to survive. She stayed in Paris, but with a completely different outlook on the world. A month later, she sent me a letter to our bus depot. She wrote that meeting Stefan was the best therapy for her. She realized, if you can wait 40 years and find your happiness, then all her minor troubles are just dust on the windshield of my bus, easily washed away by the first rain. Now, whenever I pass the Pont Alexander III, I always involuntarily slow down a little. It seems to me that somewhere there, amidst the bustle of Parisian streets and the sound of the water, the melody of the old violin without strings still echoes. A melody that proved to be stronger than time, borders, and iron curtains. And what are you carrying in your luggage? Perhaps you also have an old case you are afraid to open. Maybe it's time to finally play your main song, even if your violin hasn't had strings for a long time. This was Road Diary on the Highway E40 channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next trip. Take care of yourselves on the roads, and remember, the most important part of the journey is not the destination, but who you become while you are getting there. See you on the next journey.